The book of First Chronicles deals with the question in the big picture of legacy. And there are two legacies that are compared side by side, the legacy of God's faithfulness and the legacy of God's people who were less than faithful. And this first 9 chapters is not over, as I've said a couple of times now, not overly inspirational when it comes to reading. However, there are some significant commentaries. And if we pause and we look at the 9 chapters as a whole, and we ask ourselves, what is the chronicler, Ezra, trying to emphasize? Because this is all backstory. This is drawing the background for everything that he's going to tell. We can greater and understand more significantly the other stories that he is going to tell, because he's chosen his material carefully. He's not just writing a linear history where everybody gets exactly the same treatment. He's picking and choosing his stories because he's got something he wants to say. He's got a message that he wants to communicate. So part of the backstory for both 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because originally it was just one book, and everything that's in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, if we think of it as not just a story being told, but a painting, or perhaps a puppet play that is taking place in front of us with a backdrop. That backdrop is found in Deuteronomy chapter 4. And although the chronicler does not reference these verses specifically, that is, he doesn't quote them, he does refer to their meaning and their context as a summary statement of the larger covenant truths that God has made with his people. So Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 26 until verse 35, let me just read that. He says, I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, this is God speaking to Israel, that this day you will quickly perish from the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. Well, what was Israel's experience in the time of the chronicler? They had lost the land, right? So this is going back now to the time of Moses, and the chronicler is going to remind them of these truths. You will not live there long, but will certainly be destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and only a few of you will survive among the nations to which the Lord will drive you. From there you will worship man-made gods of wood and stone, which cannot see, or hear, or eat, or smell. But if from there you seek the Lord your God, you will find him, if you seek him with all your heart and all your soul. And when you are in distress, and all these things have happened to you, then in the later days you will return to the Lord your God and obey him. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not abandon or destroy you, or forget the covenant with your ancestors, which he confirmed to them by oath. Ask now about the former days, long before your time, from the day God created human beings on the earth. So here's some creation theology, and we're going to see it again in just a minute. Think about the former days, long before your time, from the day God created human beings on the earth. Ask from one end of the heavens to the other, has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of fire as you have and lived? Has any God tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by testings, by signs, by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, by great and awesome deeds, like the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? And where is Israel now? At the time of the chronicler, they are again coming out of sort of a similar type of captivity. And how? Because of God's providence. You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord is God. Beside him, there is no other. And that becomes a theme that resonates through the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is the journals of the two men leading the campaign to rebuild Jerusalem. Ezra is probably the author of this book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And not only are they telling history, but they're telling theology through history. So in verse 32, there's an emphasis there on God in his creative handiwork, and that theme is going to come up over and over again. And then we see earlier in this text the the restoration of God's people, that they would be scattered, but they would be restored. And that's the life experience of the people the chronicler is writing to, is re-documenting the history. So if we keep that in the back of our mind, then some of the things in these genealogies become much more significant, and we kind of go, aha, this is not just a legacy. He's not just, Ancestry.com didn't exist. So they couldn't go back and do DNA to figure out who belonged to what tribe. But through careful documentation, and those documents were cared for through the generations of Israel's existence, they're able to go back, and the chronicler goes back and he says, now here's how everything connects together. And notice in verse 1, the very first name in the list of 1 Chronicles 1, Adam. Why? Why go back to Adam? Why not just start with Abraham or Moses? Well, because this connection to Creator is so foundational in Israel's thinking, and it has to be foundational in our perceptions. As we have our own backdrop and see how God is doing stuff, and we are confused sometimes, and we wonder how things are unraveling or unpacking or how they're going to go, the chronicler starts with Adam because of this creation theology. But Adam is much more than just, the start of everything. It was Adam and Eve to whom the first promises of redemption were made after they rebelled against God in the garden. And it was Adam that had that initial relationship with the Creator that was perfect, then broken, and then restored. And in many ways, the life of Adam serves for Israel, as they're going back into the promised land, as a sample. This is what happened to Adam, and God is faithful. It's the same God, and God is doing the same kind of restoration for us. Restoration of relationship, reconciliation with God. The mandate given to Adam was, as God's image bearer, to represent the king in his kingdom and to steward the resources of the Creator in his creation. And as Israel grew into a nation, starting with that family, that couple, and then tribes, and then finally becoming a nation, that mandate did not change. They were corporately to continue on that role, which is what we do today. That's part of who we are. You've heard me say it over and over again here at Q50. Our job is to represent Christ well. Our mandate is to steward the resources of the Creator and to represent the King in his kingdom. So as these people of God are now coming back into the city, and with beginning by Adam and thinking through everything associated with Adam, his rebellion and his restoration, but at that very beginning, the fact he was created in God's image, I wonder if their minds didn't resonate a little bit with Isaiah, because Isaiah prophesied that the events they were living were going to happen in Isaiah 42. Here is my servant, whom I uphold. And the servant, in one hand, they would have understood to be Isaiah, because he was the one speaking. But then they started to understand in a bigger sense it was Israel as a nation. And then ultimately, it was Messiah that was being referred to. Whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged until he establishes justice on the earth. In his teaching the islands will find their hope. This is what God the Lord says, the Creator of heaven and earth, who stretches them out, who spreads them out of the earth, and all that springs from it, who gives breath to his people, and life to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you, and will make you to be a covenant for the people, and a light for the Gentiles. And Israel understood that, as Isaiah preached it originally, to refer to them as a nation, and ultimately, obviously, the Messiah. But this was the role of Israel, to open the eyes that are blind, to free the captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. And it's quoted by Luke, this text, to refer to the ministry of Messiah in fulfillment of this. But who are the people reading and thinking about this when they think about their heritage, starting with Adam and the role that God gave them and how they had deviated from that? Well, it's Israel coming back into the promised land. It's a renewed Israel. It's a hopeful Israel. It's an Israel that wants to be what God wants them to be, to re-embrace that original role. And here's an ancient prophecy that reminds them of God's faithfulness and what God can do, because they are captives who have been released from prison and out of dungeons and have been living in darkness. And now they're saying to themselves, wow, God is fulfilling this prophecy. And in part, it was. It was the kind of fulfillment that gives them hope. It wasn't the full and complete fulfillment, but it was part of this prophecy. So the chronicler, I know it's an awful lot packed into a single name, and then, the list of names that go on from there. But he starts with Adam, a reminder of God the Creator. God who initially established covenant and reconciliation and restoration. And for these people to be reminded that their roots do not just go back to a political rebellion against the Egyptian, but it goes back to a moment in which God created the heavens and the earth, and this is still their God. So we're going to jump ahead, and there are a couple of more just details in this list I want to draw our attention to. In chapter 3, verse 1. So, as I said, this is very selective. Not everybody who was born is listed here. That'd be impossible to record. It's just highlights and key people. In chapter 3, verse 1, with this backdrop starting with going all the way back to Adam, it says, these were the sons of David. Now, if you've been in captivity and you've seen your nation destroyed and the greatest king you ever had was David, wouldn't you want to know that these are the sons of David? And there's a reminder that this David, who was clearly God's anointed, is still part of your heritage. It's, if only David were here. Well, guess what? You have a legacy with David. These are the sons of David, born to him in Hebron. The firstborn was Amon, the son of whoever, Ennion of Jezreel. And you can read that. I'm not going to stumble all over these names. But go down to verse 4. David reigned in Jerusalem for 33 years. There is hope, people. Remember David? He reigned for 33 years in Jerusalem. And that's what we're doing. And God promised that there would be a Messiah and there would be someone to sit on his throne. Remember, we saw it before, and now we're beginning to see it again. There is hope. David reigned. He reigned and he had longevity. And then notice verse 5. And then he had lots of children. And what was the promise of God to Abraham? That you will have a land and you will have a nation that will be innumerable, and that through you all the world will be blessed. Well, David was part of the fulfillment of that. So the chronicler is careful to not only focus on Adam, the connection with the Creator, but here's David, the king, and the fulfillment of God's promise back then. And if God was faithful back then, can it possibly be that God is faithful now? The answer obviously is yes. Jump ahead to chapter 5, verse 1. Again, all of these are selective. The chronicler is not just recording history, he's making theological statements. The sons of Rueben were the firstborn of Israel. And we know the firstborn, that's an important concept in the ancient culture. He was firstborn, but when he defiled his father's marriage bed, his rights as firstborn were given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so he could not be listed in the genealogical record in accordance with the birthright. And although Judah was the strongest of the brothers, with a ruler came out of him, the rights of the firstborn belonged to Joseph. A little editorial commentary there, because the contemporary audience of Ezra may not have known all those details. The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. Then he goes through a list of stuff that happened, and down into verse 20 of chapter 5. It says, the Reubenites, starting at verse 18, the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh had 44,760 people ready for military service, able-bodied men who could handle shield and sword, who could use a bow, and they were trained for battle. So these people were warriors. That's encouraging for these Israelites who are in the city of Jerusalem, and people, they're being heckled. At one point, someone comes along and says, even if a fox were to jump on your wall, it would fall over. So they're facing all this anxiety and stress It says in verse 19, they waged war against the Hagarites, Jetur, Naphish, and Nodab, and they were helped in fighting them. And God handed the Hagarites and all their allies over to them, because they cried to him during the battle, and he answered their prayers, because they trusted in him. It's a very important theological commentary, that God was faithful. Why? Because they confessed their need for him, and he heard them, and so he intervened for them. But then we come down to verse 25, and there's another list of warriors and all the things, but verse 25, but they were unfaithful to the God of their fathers, and prostituted themselves to the gods of the people of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, the ones who had taken the northern tribe not so long ago into captivity, and the half-tribe of Manasseh into exile. And he took them to Halal and Habor and Haran, the river of Gozan, where they are to this day. So here we've got this amazing contrast. We've had the genealogy of David, we've had the genealogy of Rueben, and some editorial comments about how important that is. And then we have a contrast of a group of people who were mighty warriors, and they were in a need, and so they prayed to God, and God heard them, and because they trusted him, God responded. And then another group that betrayed God and worshiped other gods and practiced idolatry, in fact calls it prostitution, and how because of that God stirred, not at random, they didn't become victims at random, but God stirred the heart of a foreign king to come and to take these people into captivity. Why? Because in Deuteronomy chapter 4 it says, if you abandon me, you will be scattered amongst the nations. So as the chronicler begins telling the story of Israel, and reminding these people who are struggling to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and to be restored into that place where God has promised them with this covenant, he also paints it in the text or in the context of a backdrop that says, don't forget your heritage. Don't forget the good things your people have done, and don't forget the mistakes your people have made. And all of it in the context of Deuteronomy chapter 4. Then we come to chapter 6. And here's an entire chapter. We've had various tribes explained and getting, half a chapter or 3 or 4 verses as the chronicler documents all the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he comes to the tribe of Levi. The tribe gets an entire chapter, which, the chronicler didn't write in chapters of verses. That was added way, way later, and only a couple of hundred years ago, really, or a few hundred years ago. But nonetheless, the proportionate length that the tribe of Levi gets in all of these genealogies is disproportionate. Why? Because these were the ones who orchestrated the worship of God. These were the priests. These were the ones that were coming back into the city, and along with Ezra and Nehemiah, were trying to reintegrate and to reinitialize worship in the temple. So in verse 31 of chapter 6, these are the men David put in charge of the music of the house there. They ministered with music before the tabernacle of the tent of meeting until Solomon built the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. They performed their duties according to the regulations laid down for them. Here are the men who served together with their sons. And then there's a long list. Why? Because Ezra and Nehemiah were trying to do exactly the same thing, to restore worship in the temple. And especially in the book of Ezra, you see the struggle he had for the Israelites to come and to get rid of their old habits and to worship the one true God. And so he acknowledges, look at this great list of men and their sons who led in worship in the temple. This is important. And then in verse 49, starting in verse 48, their fellow Levites were assigned to all their duties of the tabernacle of the house of God. But Aaron and his descendants were the ones who presented offerings on the altar of burnt offering and on the altar of incense in connection with all that was done in the most holy place, making atonement for Israel. That's what Israel needed, right? The contemporaries of Ezra, the chronicler is talking to. They needed atonement, and Aaron did that in accordance with all that Moses, the servant of God, had commanded. And then there's a long list of who those people are. Why? Because Ezra is trying to prioritize and stress to his contemporary audience We need to get back to worshiping the one true God, and not just in ritual, but like we see in the story of Rueben, we trust in God. And a phrase we're going to see throughout the book of First and Second Chronicles is this contrast between those who had faith in God and those who broke faith away from God. And in this contrast, an object lesson, a history lesson that says to the contemporary Israelites, let's not make the same mistake again. Let's remember who our Creator is. Let's remember the promise He made in Deuteronomy 4 that He alone is God and there is no other. Then we come to chapter 9, which is the beginning of the end of all of these genealogies. And we have a theological commentary made here in chapter 9, starting at verse 1. So all Israel was recorded in the genealogies, and obviously not meaning every individual, but the entirety of the nation and an overview of its history. These were written in the book of the kings of Israel. Then notice this next line. And Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. They were unfaithful. And all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 4, the promise had been, if you abandon me, then you will be scattered. I will not abandon you. I will not leave you. I will not ignore you. You will always be my children, but you will be scattered. But now then in chapter 9, verse 2, there's a beginning of a new genealogy and a new generation. Now the first to resettle on their own property and their own towns were some of the Israelites, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. So there's hope, because God's people are coming back, and not just anybody, but those who are responsible to guide God's people and worship. And that was their identity as a nation. That's why Psalm 122 makes so much sense in this context. I was happy when they said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord, because that wasn't just going to church on Sunday. That was an expression of their faith, of their ideology, of their identity as a nation. That this is who we are. We are Israelites, and we worship the one true God, creator of heaven and earth. And while they always paid lip service to that, they never stopped saying we worship the one true God. In practice, they abandoned their exclusive worship of that one true God. So what's the theology behind the genealogy? Genealogical, theological ideas here. If you take the time, and you may want to do that, read through the first 9 chapters in preparation for looking at some of the stories that come in the later part, you will see a theme begin to appear, and we see it, especially if we put the context of what we looked at earlier, Deuteronomy 4, Psalm 122, that although God's people abandoned Him, God never abandoned them. He was consistent to His word that He would restore them, and that they would have to go through a process of learning. Hebrews 12 calls it discipline. Whom the Lord loves, He disciplines, and that's a reference back to some Old Testament scriptures. But it's not discipline in the sense of punishment, that they had to pay for their sins in order to get back into the land, but rather through that process they would learn who their God is and the nature of the unique relationship they had with that God and the very special function they had in His creation as His image bearers to bring light to the Gentiles, as it says in Isaiah 42. So the genealogy, the theology of the genealogy, at its very core is that God never abandoned His people. And in fact, we see the fingerprints of God in the king of Assyria being stirred up to go and invade the nation Israel because of their unfaithfulness. So even in that, God was engaged and He never abandoned them. I think there's huge relevance for us because there are times we feel abandoned. We wonder, God, are you really controlling this thing? Whether it's in a personal issue or you're looking at something happening culturally or socially or politically or whatever it may be, sometimes we wonder, and the popular theme out there in our culture is God is irrelevant. It's a social construct to help, psychologically, and there is sort of a spiritual part to human nature. And if you can construct a God that helps you keep centered and contribute to the betterment of society, then that's a wonderful thing. But just don't tell us that God has any authority over us. Whereas this God is clearly linked back to being the creator God who has authority over all things because he's the creator. And he never abandoned his people. And it's a lifetime pursuit to understand that, because our emotions and our perceptions and the messaging around us is so strong about even if God is relevant. Yet in the Chronicler, one of the foundational truths emphasized throughout these first 9 chapters, as all of these names are listed, is a reminder that God never abandoned his people. Secondly, through these stories, and I've just hit a few highlights, but it's there fairly consistently, is that events of national and international intrigue were orchestrated by God, were purposed by God, and it is impossible to outmanipulate God. And if that's true at the national and international level, then that's probably true at the personal level. I can't outwit God, right? This isn't spiritual survivor, outwit, outlast, outplay. God does not march to my drumbeat, but in his grace, he meets me where I am. Grace trumps guilt. And if there were a group of people that ever needed to hear that message, it's these returnees, these refugees coming back from Babylon to rebuild a city that had been completely pillaged and destroyed, to put up with heckling of their enemies, belittling them, challenging them, to try, and despite generations of living in an environment of worshiping Marduk and other false gods, to come back and to say, we are now going to worship the one true God, and we are going to commit to that, and we're going to change our lifestyle habits and patterns because we believe this is what God wants us to do. And third, consistent with the terms of the covenant, like we saw in Deuteronomy 4, they were still God's people no matter what they did. And the return to the land and the promise of the king and the hope that was yet to come was still always theirs, even though they often just didn't understand it or chose to ignore it. But they were still God's people. The faithfulness of God to his covenant people. The faithfulness of God to those who have been redeemed. And in the Old Testament, that was through the affiliation with the nation Israel, through the practice of the old covenant, through worship in the temple. And it was always faith in God, but it was expressed differently. It was expressed through sacrifice and through the participation in the ethnic and the cultural practices of Israel. But today, under the new covenant, we have the priesthood of the believers, and we can all serve. And the gospel is a global entity, and everybody has the opportunity to be equal partners in this new covenant. And if we are part of that new covenant community of faith, we are always God's people. And despite how we may struggle, and despite sometimes the choices we make that we know, and I'm not saying you, I'm saying us, if not me, make choices sometimes that I know are not the ones that God would want me to make. Yet I am still, he is ready to forgive. And I am still assured of his love and his covenant care for me, the new covenant that we have in Christ because of his work on the cross.